The statistics are staggering. According to Alzheimer's Disease International, somebody develops dementia every 3 seconds. What? Although hope may lie on the horizon, there are currently no real clinical drugs to help this condition. But maybe we've been looking at the disease all wrong. Today, we're lucky enough to talk to Dr. Ken Sharlin, a board-certified neurologist, consultant, functional medicine practitioner, author of the #1 best-selling Healthy Brain Toolbox, Strategies to Improve Your Memory and Function, to give us what his take on this disease is. So, and with that lengthy title, I would like to introduce everybody to a friend of mine, Dr. Kenneth Sharlin over there in Missouri, brave in the trenches of the winter weather. I just wanted to open up by kind of asking a little bit about your background and what it is that you do now.
So I am a board certified neurologist. I'm a medical doctor. So you may hear other people claim the brain, as it were, but I'm an MD. And I grew up in New Jersey, eventually going to medical school in Atlanta, Georgia at Emory University, very traditional, well-respected medical school. And I only say that because ultimately what came out of all that training, that education, was a very traditional approach to medicine, a very traditional approach to neurology, a pretty narrow view of the world, if you will, in terms of, we see our patients, they either have symptoms or an established diagnosis. If they have symptoms, it's my job to figure out what's going on, make the diagnosis, and treat the condition. And always at that point, unfortunately, what traditionally happens is once you have the diagnosis, the person sort of vaporizes, right? The doctor's focused on the disease, the diagnosis. The person has multiple sclerosis, the person has Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, and we're treating the disease. We tend to forget about the person. And this is what we call chronic disease management in our country. We've got this toolbox, and it's full of drugs, and it sometimes has some procedures in it, but by and large, we're managing the disease and giving people very little hope. And what I ultimately discovered several years back is that there had to be a better way.
No, I think this is something that you really get into in the book, and you kind of talk about your own upbringing, coming from humble beginnings, by humble means, and also your background in endurance sports, which I found really interesting. So I kind of wondered what drew you specifically to medicine and specifically neurology when you're just going from that conventional setting.
Yeah, well, I grew up in New Jersey, as I said. Actually, my mother was a teacher, special education teacher. My father is a pediatrician. He's mostly retired, does a little bit of consulting work in his early 80s, but mostly retired now. So I did have that exposure to medicine growing up, but I really didn't come to all of that from sort of a science background or this desire to explore diseases or whatever that is. I actually loved to write. In high school, I was in a special English class. It was kind of a pilot class where they taught traditional high school English through writing. And I wrote a lot of poetry and short stories, and went on to college in the Midwest called Kenyon College, very well known for its literary journal and having graduated many famous writers. And so that was kind of the world that I was immersed in, was liberal arts, search for the truth. That's what we always say in the liberal arts, campuses, truth with the big T. And so there was very, I was kind of a little bit conflicted because I hadn't really explored what I wanted to do with my life for sure. I thought maybe I should become a doctor. It made sense. My father was a doctor. My mother was a teacher. There was no real reason I shouldn't perhaps pursue that. But, I come from a Jewish background. So, you're a doctor or lawyer or whatever. But at any rate, that all aside, it's kind of figuring out how to navigate this in my own life. And a couple of interesting things happened. First, one day I happened to be at home. My father regularly received these magazines kind of geared toward physicians at leisure, and there happened to be a cover article on a physician whose name was John Stone. Dr. Stone is a cardiologist at Emory University. He was also a very well-published poet. And I was really struck by this whole physician-writer combination, because that's kind of where I was coming from. And thought, oh, maybe this is possible. Maybe it's possible to blend the two. And actually wrote Dr. Stone kind of a fan mail. In those days, we didn't really do email. So I just put a letter in an envelope, put a stamp on it, threw some of my poetry in there, and I was shocked when he wrote back to me and made some suggestions about my writing. And that actually started this, sort of long distance relationship, if you will, of writing back and forth, exchanging ideas. Eventually, I went down to Emory University when I was a college student and interviewed Dr. Stone for a graduate thesis that I was writing. It was on the physician as writer. So there was that piece of it, kind of finding a way to bridge literature. I also read books by Oliver Sacks. Dr. Sacks was a neurologist. He passed away not too long ago from cancer, but he wrote many books, but he wrote a book called The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. And wow, that just changed my world. And it kind of got into this whole thing of, search for the truth and philosophy and the things that literature sort of explored, in the way that changes in the brain could really just bend your whole perception of your world. Everything that we think of as sort of tangibly as us beyond our body, our thoughts, our dreams, our ideas, they're really biochemical reactions. And, just pull a few plugs and everything completely changes. Dr. Stone's book was all about what we called non-dominant parietal lobe damage from stroke and things like that. And basically that's a section of your brain where if there's damage, the left side of your world doesn't exist to you. Someone could show you your left hand and you'd say, whose hand is that? It's completely bizarre. People, put on glasses kind of sideways because they don't see that their left eye is part of their face. They'll eat from only the right side of the plate if food is put in front of them. They'll read from only one side of the newspaper. So all of that kind of bent my perception of reality. And then after college, I had an opportunity to live in Washington, D.C. for a year, and I hung out with a lot of writers there, and among them, William Meredith, who was the former poet laureate of the United States. And Bill Meredith had a stroke, and this was there are varying degrees of strokes, I suppose. They were all serious in their own way, but he had a major stroke, and he actually lost his capacity for language, which I thought was just so profound, considering he was the poet laureate. So I actually worked with Bill Meredith a little bit, just kind of helping him out, getting him to his appointments, and we actually went through at that time. This was about 1986, 87. At that time, books that were being published, everything was still done on paper. So you'd get galleys in the mail, these big, long sheets of paper, and we'd have to go through and read all these proofs. And I read his proofs to him because he could understand. He just couldn't speak that well. And so we proofed his new and selected works, and they went on to win the Pulitzer Prize, which was kind of cool. So at any rate, I was very, very inspired by all of this world that intersected the brain and literature and writing and all that stuff. And that's how I got into it.
I think that's something that you, I don't know if you dive that deep into the book. You might actually, if I remember, but I just find your story really interesting. And I find that as over time, you mentioned you kind of get tired of the conventional way of seeing patients over time. And so you kind of discovered this world of functional medicine. I kind of wanted to ask you, when someone hears functional medicine, what do you define functional medicine as?
Well, functional medicine, first of all, is definitely a patient-centered approach. So that reference I made earlier to, you make the diagnosis and you kind of forget about the patient. You do have to obviously take that person into account. Some of their personal habits and, needs, and their family, and, do they drive, do they not drive, whatever the things that might play into what drug is prescribed. But we really just assume that once you have the disease, that's it. And you're more or less faced with managing that disease and either prescribing a drug, referring to, say, a physical or occupational therapist or speech therapist, whatever we call that, allied health professional, or a surgeon, or maybe doing some kind of interventional procedure that's quasi-surgical, but not as interventional as open surgery, sticking a needle in and injecting something and so forth.
Right.
But basically, you're just stuck with these diseases, and that's very unsatisfactory. There's a reason when we get sick, and we all get sick. It's understandable. But we do get sick for a reason. I'm writing a proposal, and I went to the medical literature today to look something up, and there was an article that came out in the journal Nature a few years back that said 90% of cancer is not just bad luck. 90% of cancer is due to environmental factors and lifestyle.
Yeah.
I mean, that's stuff that we have control over. And if that's causal, right, then that also means that it's a mediator, it's a perpetuator. So there's sort of, think of like a seesaw, right, or something that has a fulcrum, and it's tipped in such a way that in the first part, as you're going uphill toward that fulcrum, you may not realize it, but you're getting sick, and it could be getting sick over months or even years in the case of Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson's disease. These diseases evolve over 10 to 20 years. So before you even know something is wrong, well, something is wrong, right? It's happening. And then you reach that focal point, and then things tip. And then you start to realize, wait, I'm having trouble with people's names. Can't remember, a conversation that I had yesterday. But then it continues, right? Then you would just traditionally continue along that trajectory. And this makes absolutely no sense at all. I mean, we do need these tools in our toolbox that are medicines. They're helpful. I'm not against any of that. But why should it just be that? Why can't we change the trajectory a little bit by modifying environmental factors, by modifying lifestyle for those who are willing to make changes? And thereby, even if we're not completely reversing these diseases, we're definitely altering their natural course and their trajectory. And people feel and function and think and, all of the things that we think about when we think about getting sick, a lot of that stuff goes away, or it's much less of a problem. That's functional medicine.
I think I couldn't have said it any more beautifully. I think the way you perceive the human body really makes a difference for the patient that's going through the symptoms that they're experiencing. And to quote you in the book, the standard practice in medicine is a pill for an ill. And the book obviously focuses around the brain. And so as a functional medicine practitioner and also a conventionally trained neurologist, you go through this really, really interesting two opposing views of disease in your book, and how each practice looks at diagnosis. So we kind of just talked about what the main difference is between functional and conventional medicine approaches. When you have the patient come in, they describe the symptoms, you try to find the disease. Then from the conventional view, you try to find the best drug to fit that symptom or illness. Makes sense. And so the Brain Tune-Up, Brain Toolbox, your book, what I found staggering was that a lot of the times when someone comes in to see you for cognitive issues or otherwise, they've really just, like you mentioned, hit the tip of the iceberg with their problems. They've finally had the domino fall that's resulting in these more noticeable symptoms that probably has been around for several years, if not longer. And so maybe you could explain the ins and outs of kind of some of the main drivers you see in disease that are commonalities with these various, whether it's cognitive or Parkinson's. I know we mentioned environment, but maybe we can get a little more specific, if that makes sense.
100%. So first of all, I do definitely want to emphasize that you're correct. There are commonalities. It's one of the most remarkable things about medicine, whether we're talking about functional medicine, whether we're talking about conventional medicine. Somebody comes in with carpal tunnel syndrome, which is a pinched nerve in the wrist. Basically, it's your part of your flexor muscles, in your hand, or it innervates the flexion muscles in your hand. They'll say, "Hey, I wake up in the middle of the night, my hand is numb, I have to shake it out," and you hear that story over and over again. There's a test called a nerve conduction test that we use to diagnose this trapped nerve syndrome. But a really good diagnostician, whether we're talking about carpal tunnel syndrome or whether we're talking about a more sophisticated diagnosis, in the end, you kind of know what's going on. You're just using that test to confirm your suspicion, right? And so these stories do repeat themselves. But functional medicine really, in the sense that it's patient-centered, and it really sort of prides itself in focusing on the uniqueness of each person's story. So we start a functional medicine journey with something called a timeline. And I sort of alluded to it in my explanation about the sort of pre-sick to becoming sick with the seesaw analogy with the fulcrum. We want to take a history, and it's a very different history than, tell me when you first started to notice a change and how did it evolve and is it there all the time and what makes it worse and what makes it better. We call that the history of present illness. And that really is the cornerstone of taking a history in traditional medicine. It's that encapsulation of the present problem. Yes, we do ask you about, hey, do you have any other health issues? You have high blood pressure, you have diabetes, whatever. We say, did anything run in your family, your parents still around? But the core of the traditional history is this encapsulation of the present problem. Functional medicine is very different. Functional medicine starts out with, hey, where were you born? And tell me about your brothers or sisters, if you have any, and a little bit about your dad and a lot about your mom, because she had you. And that makes a big difference, because even the trip through the birth canal, even whether or not you happen to be breastfed or bottle fed, can have a huge impact on your health later in life. But then we talk about your early life and, your infancy, your toddlerhood, your early childhood, those school age years. Did you play sports? In functional medicine, we want to know everything from, what was the energy of your household? Was it, super supportive? Was it a high stress household? Was there a family member maybe struggled with alcoholism or even abuse? These things do have an impact on your health later in life. Were you playing sports? Did you hit your head? Were you exposed to chemicals during your lifetime? What did you eat growing up? What was typical meals? Did you get sick a lot? Did you have your tonsils taken out? Did you have your appendix taken out? And all of these sorts of things, these little ripples in the pond. In my mind, I always think of throwing pebbles in the pond. They just make these kind of just little ripples. Like, oh, they're going to go away. They're going to go away. But they accumulate. And then eventually you have that tsunami where things get really bad. And there's that tipping point. Now, what are those commonalities? So we kind of touched on them there. So it could be early signs of changes in this ecological system that we really are, but especially focusing on the gut, on the microbes that inhabit the gut. Early hits to the immune system, or really throughout your life. We very commonly, for example, see people who have multiple sclerosis who report a history of mononucleosis caused by the Epstein-Barr virus. That's just an example. In dementia, such as Alzheimer's, another virus, the herpes virus that causes the cold sores, can play a major role. So hits to the immune system and infections can play a role. We talked about chemical exposures. A lot of people I see have grown up in rural communities, or they say, we were playing outside in our neighborhood and they drive that truck that sprayed the mosquito spray down the road, and we just continue playing in a cloud of mosquito poison, or pesticides, herbicides, things like that, paints, lacquers, and other chemicals that people use in various shops, welders exposed to alloys like manganese. These are important. Sometimes other toxins like mold can play a role. These are all triggers. And in my view, because some of your listeners may also listen to other podcasts or shows and things like that where there are other opinion leaders, I don't subscribe to the idea that you have this one disease, but it's not actually the diagnosis, it's actually something else. In other words, I hear this a lot with multiple sclerosis or a disease called Lou Gehrig's disease or ALS, where people say, yeah, that's what they told me the diagnosis is, but I actually have Lyme disease. Yeah, that's what they told me the diagnosis is, but I actually have mold. Well, no, unfortunately, you probably have MS and you probably have or ALS or whatever the diagnosis is, but it's really about understanding all of the factors. It's never just, in traditional medicine, we love to say, what caused it, right? What caused it, doc? The reality is that a lot of things caused it. And my friend Dale Bredesen coined this expression, the 36 holes in the roof, when it refers to Alzheimer's disease. But the fact of the matter is there are 36 holes in the roof, whether it's MS, whether it's Alzheimer's, whether it's Parkinson's, whether it's ALS, whether it's migraine, whether it's peripheral neuropathy, etc. It's a matter of understanding the person, their uniqueness, which will play a role not just in cause, but in how we approach treatment, as you kind of put it. But yes, there are commonalities. There are things that we look for. In older women, especially, but guys too, hormones can play a huge role. Generally, guys can maintain hormone levels throughout their life. Every once in a while you hear about that movie star who's 70 years old, married the 20-something and decided to have kids. Hey, more power to him. But, generally speaking, men can. Now, there are various factors that definitely will interfere with things like testosterone in men. Don't get me wrong, they will. But 100% of women, will either have biological menopause or have their ovaries and uterus removed surgically, 100%. And we know that the impact of these low levels of hormones on the brain over time can be profound. So that's another important trigger.
I think the one thing we can kind of take away too from this section of the podcast is that, like you mentioned, many times when people, including myself, have gone and sought a diagnosis, everybody's looking for a word or a thing to blame. They want the A equals B, when in probably 90% or more of the cases, it's a ABC equals D situation. And it's not something that is as simple as, oh, you have this virus and this is the whole thing that caused this whole problem. And there's also a lot of other considerations that you mentioned in your book, such as stress. How does mental stress and chronic stress, how does that play into disease process with these other factors?
Well, it is definitely a huge factor. And in fact, a very dear friend of mine, Dr. Norm Shealy, who's a neurosurgeon, and many consider him one of the patriarchs of holistic medicine. He's a neurosurgeon. Norm is about 87 or 88 now. He started his career as a neurosurgeon. They would say to cut is to cure. And if you just follow his career, it's a very, very remarkable career. For the most part, what he does now is focus on helping people get out of that stress lane and settle their central nervous system and the rest of their body. Everything, of course, is connected by addressing how our bodies react to stress. But fundamentally, what all of this is about is, in a sense, it's survival, it's self-protection. You have this part of the brain called the limbic system. It's on alert all the time. It's sort of our unconscious brain, and it's always checking out the environment. And when I use that term environment, it's both the external environment, the soup that we are immersed in, and it most definitely is a soup of all kinds of things, but also our internal environment. It's, our limbic system can sense if something is not right, if there's a nutrient imbalance, a fatty acid imbalance, if there's an infection, it can sense both those physical stressors and those emotional or psychosocial stressors. And in the end, the reaction is going to be the same. It's going to be, do we need to protect Ryan? Do we need to protect Dr. Sharlin? So in other words, in the very acute situation, in the short term, these responses that are stress responses are protective. They're helpful. We need them. I always refer to the guy that the child's pinned underneath the car and he lifts the car and saves the child, and they say, how did you do that? He said, I don't even know. That was 2,000 pounds you just lifted, right? That's that acute stress response. It makes us do these incredible things. And, in a moment's notice, we go into survival mode. Functional medicine providers love to talk about, being chased. You're being chased by the saber-toothed tiger, right? And this is your response. There's a great book called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And it's just all the same idea. The zebra's out there, he's chill, he's eating grass, he doesn't have a worry in the world. And then there's the lion. The lion goes, oh, maybe dinner, right? Goes after the zebra. And one of two things happen. Either the zebra gets away or the zebra's eaten. If the zebra gets away, he's back eating grass, and he's chill and he doesn't have any worries, and he's not sitting there going, oh my gosh, oh my gosh, oh my gosh, I almost got eaten by the lion, I almost got eaten by the lion, right? Human beings go, I almost got eaten by a lion, day after day after day after day. So the difference here, what we're talking about, is really how the brain and the body ultimately adapt these chronic stresses where I always tell my patients, I have this little sports car. It's not a fancy car or anything, but it's got the manual shift and it's got the tachometer, and if you ever drive a little sports car, the fun gears in the sports car, besides, maybe seeing how fast you can go, or the second and third gear where, you take it out of first, put it in second, press down on the accelerator. It has that, that pickup, right? And that you can watch that tachometer go above whatever the red line is, 7,000 RPMs. You're not really that worried because you're not going to drive the car like that. I mean, you're not going to go down your local highway at, try to go at 60 miles an hour in second gear. You'd destroy the engine. But the fact of the matter is that we as human beings do this compulsively all the time. And whether a person understands functional medicine or not, they certainly have friends, family, or themselves. They go, hey, dude, you got to chill, man. You're going to break down. You're going to, you can't keep going. How many times have we heard that expression? You can't keep going that way, right? And that translates into some very definite biochemistry that revolves around hormones like cortisol. And that's our survival hormone. So we've known for decades now what happens to the brain and what happens to the body when you're trying to drive your car in the red line all the time. And what ultimately happens is a little genie steps in and says, I'm going to install a governor. I'm not going to take the car away, but I'm not going to let you drive it above the red line. So you can drive it. It's kind of boring. You have no power anymore. You can't go above 60, right? And you go. And how do we feel when we're like that? I can get up and go, but I have no energy. I hate to get out of bed. My brain doesn't work. Everything just doesn't feel right. Well, we got there somehow, right? We got there somehow.
That really speaks. I think so many people can relate to that feeling. Pretty much everyone I talk to, one of their major concerns or one of their major symptoms is this kind of their body just has suddenly, after going for so long, just quit. And I was in that state myself, and I've talked about it in this podcast a lot, where I was pushing and pushing and pushing, amongst other things. But eventually your body, like you said, is just going to say, you know what, we're just not going anymore. And we're going to stop you because you're tanked out, and you tanked out weeks ago or months ago, and we're just going to stop. And then your body's just in this chronic fatigue state after that. And it's about really looking at all the factors, and you got to kind of look at it as a replenishment stage because you've just taxed every system in your body. And I think that's something that kind of can elude people in a conventional medicine setting because we're often looking for maybe from a functional standpoint, looking for multiple triggers or multiple systems interacting with each other. When you work in a specialty, they're only working within that specialty, whether it's cardiology, neurology, endocrinology. And sometimes it's hard to get those people to work together and connect all those dots and make that make that assumption.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so kind of as we reach, midway point here in our podcast, you call this book the Brain Toolbox for a reason. You're giving
Healthy
us
Brain Toolbox.
Yeah, you're giving us some tools that we can utilize from a broad standpoint to kind of begin our quote healing journey. And one of these things that a lot of people are starting to catch on to now, especially if you're in the chronic illness space, you probably looked at it, and that's food is medicine. I hear a lot of people talk about it. Dr. Mark Hyman talks about it. Dr. Terry Wallace talks about it. You talk about it a lot in your book. Maybe you can give us just some brief ideas or things you mentioned in your book about how we can use food as medicine.
Food is medicine, and it's one of the foundational lifestyle factors that also includes sleep. Mm-hmm. We've touched on stress, movement, and then actually our relationship to others, our human connection, which we saw very well represented as a problem in this past year when folks were put on social isolation and they either had a breakdown or they just, there's all this stuff in the news about, people are having parties, they're not following the rules. Yeah, but it's human nature to want to connect with other human beings, and you can't put somebody in isolation like that. Right? Yeah. That's what solitary confinement basically is. So food is medicine, and this really is one of the foundations of functional medicine. It's the thing that we all do, and most of us, gravitate toward food. It's a commonality that allows for a language between the practitioner and the patient to understand. And we do have a very strange approach to food in our society at large. We have a lot of processed foods. What does Michael Pollan call it? Edible food-like substances.
Yeah.
We put sugar in all its forms in almost everything that's processed, it's made. We just consume way too much sugar in our society. We've invented synthetic fats that fortunately are disappearing from our, processed food industry. But for a long time, we ate these trans fats, which were cancer causing. So a friend of mine was bringing up Crisco the other day, and how his mother just cooked everything with Crisco. For years. Just kills people. So we've just gotten away from that sort of food that our grandparents would eat. That I have patients now say they grow their own vegetables. They can eat their own food. There's a wonderful TED Talk where the guy speaking talks about it's like printing your own money. So why not? Make your own vegetables in your own garden. And so, this circling back around, when we were talking about stress, when it comes to food, it's really the same reaction when you put these fake foods in your body, these foods that trigger that limbic system and say, wait a minute, something is not right. This is not food. You're not getting the nutrition that your body needs. We don't just eat to feel full, right? Mm-hmm. That's a signal you should stop. Some people think you should stop before you're full. And we don't just eat for calories, although we do have to, quote, fuel our bodies. You can't exist forever on no calories, or you end up with other problems, as you like to talk about. But we also eat for nutrient density, right? There are all kinds of things that our bodies can't make. And everything we see here on this podcast comes from food, right? Yeah. It all comes from food. That old adage, you are what you eat. All your cells come from food. And if you don't eat and I'm not saying, look, we're human. Mm-hmm. It's not about having that, I indulged in whatever, that slice of birthday cake. It's about, but are you eating birthday cake every single day? And quite frankly, figuratively, there are people who basically eat birthday cake every day. It might not be birthday cake, but they're eating this kind of highly processed, sugary nonsense, and they're not delivering the nutrients, and their body goes into an alarm state, right?
Mhm.
And it starts to break down, and systems don't work, and you can't rebuild your body, and you can't, as Dr. Walls likes to talk about, maintain the membranes of your cells. You can't build the fatty coating over your nerve cells. You can't make neurotransmitters. It goes on and on and on. If you don't eat what your body needs, if you don't put gas in your car, you'd be wondering why you can't start it. You go, dude, you put gas in the engine? Like, oh yeah, I have to do that, don't I?
Yeah. So I think I think a lot of people do get to this point where their body, in some sense of the word, isn't functioning optimally, right? Their mitochondria, as Dr. Walls and a lot of people are now focusing in on, is like, really, if you look at this from a really broad spectrum, it's a lot of mitochondrial dysfunction. Your energy cells are not producing energy the way they should. They're gunked up. Maybe they're bogged up with insulin resistance. There's a lot of things that could be playing into that. And so how do you, how do you begin? I guess you begin by addressing all of these little factors one at a time. But when you're working with patients and you're going through your brain tune-up program type stuff, where do you like to start a patient at? Because everybody's a little different. You've done the case analysis on them.
Right.
Maybe you've done a lot of blood work on them. Where do you like to start with that person usually?
So that goes back to that timeline. Like you say, you have to understand where they are, where they've come from, who they are right at this moment. And then we're going to sit down with them, and I have a team-based approach. And although we do these very deep dive labs into nutrient levels, and we look at oxidative stress markers and all this cool stuff, heavy metals and infections and all kinds of things, that's cool. And that's essential. But ultimately, we have to begin with those foundations. So we have to understand what you're eating. We have to guide you toward what is referred to generally as an anti-inflammatory diet, getting you off those processed foods, getting off the sugar, getting off the dairy by and large, maybe some other things. But it shouldn't be about just taking stuff away. It should be about putting stuff in. So it's that nutrient-dense food. Dr. Walls loves to talk about 3 cups of greens, 3 cups of color, and 3 cups of sulfur. Right? It's a plant-based, nutrient-dense diet with some animal protein and animal fats, because we really thrive on those omega-3 fatty acids that we best get from animals, primarily fish, although you can get some from animals that have grazed on grass and so forth. So we really focus on the diet. But then if you're coming to my office or you're working with my team virtually, we're also looking at how you move. We're looking at how you sleep. We are looking at how you manage your stress. And again, we all have stress. This is not, in no way am I suggesting that sort of all disease is due to stress. We need stress to some degree. We just have to kind of have that measured response, and we have to be able to put it away at a certain point and function. So we look at all of that. I would say most of my patients don't have an issue with relationships, or very close to their family, their friends, although occasionally this has come up. I've seen people that are extremely socially isolated, and not surprisingly, their brains don't work very well. So we have to address that.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. I've talked about it on the podcast quite a bit. Like a lot of, there's so many factors, but a lot of, I think I'm amazed the more that I've learned about functional medicine and the various approaches, how much the mental side of it is really like a huge lock and key to actually enter a healing phase for your body. Like it's critical to address those mental deficits that you have, whether it's stress or past traumas. Like you really do need to kind of dot all the I's and cross all the T's in your past, and kind of make those things right with yourself. It's something that I've kind of always been combative with when it comes to either going to see a therapist or working with a health coach, or just assuming that everything is just the physical part of things. But there's so much mental that plays into all the chemical balances that you've mentioned previously that I find so fascinating. And I think some people get hung up on that because they just want all right, I want the supplement that'll address this, or I want the food that'll address this. I want the movement that'll address this. But there's also this game you got to play with meditation that you talk about in your book. You talk about breathing exercises in the kind of the more of the psychology section near the end of the book, which I find really important. And I think it's kind of sometimes an under-discussed portion of functional medicine, when at least from the patient side, because there's so many physical issues that they deal with that sometimes that gets put on the back burner, but it really needs to be front and center and to focus on during your journey. And so I kind of want to talk about one of the studies that you've done in your past, and it was 100 patient studies, 100 patient study on, I believe were they all Alzheimer's patients or dementia and Alzheimer's?
Yeah, so that was a group effort, and it was really headed up by Dale Bredesen, who published the book, The End of Alzheimer's. And he had, in 2014 and 2016, I believe, published 2 separate papers describing 10 patients, initially a reversal of cognitive decline. So it was a little vague on what was being reversed, whether it was the diagnosis of Alzheimer's, whether they were having brain fog. But he was just trying to say, hey, if you address these things, your brain will start to work better. And there's some remarkable things that can happen. So then 2 years later, he more or less republished the same paper, but he was much more clear that he was saying that these folks either met clinical criteria for what is called mild cognitive impairment, which is kind of like a pre-Alzheimer's or on the spectrum to becoming Alzheimer's disease, or they had Alzheimer's. So he's much more adamant, no, we can make a huge dent, not just prevent Alzheimer's, which is a whole separate discussion, but we can actually change the trajectory of this Alzheimer's disease. And he published 10 cases. And then a couple of years later, fast forward, he had trained other practitioners, including myself, in his approach. And since I have a fairly sizable clinic and I'm a neurologist, so I have access to treating lots of folks with Alzheimer's disease, and he reached out to me, said, I'd like to do 100 cases. Can you help? And I said, oh yeah, we can help. And we contributed about 36 patients to that 100 case series. And there were other practitioners who also contributed. I can't personally speak for their cases, although the assumption is all of them met criteria for either mild cognitive impairment or Alzheimer's disease. And we all used a similar approach, which was Dr. Bredesen's approach.
Could you kind of,
similar, by the way, to the brain tune-up?
Right. That's kind of what I was thinking. I guess kind of my question with some of these things is when you have something like Alzheimer's, for which I have my family has a history of Alzheimer's. My grandmother unfortunately had it. I think my grandfather had it, as well as Parkinson's. And as we mentioned before, so many factors playing into how these diseases manifest. In fact, you could have the same environmental factors and probably get 2 different diseases out of it that could have came from similar sources. It just depends on how your body manifests them. What are some of the kind of difficulties you've had when trying to help these sort of patients start to implement some of these changes? I know everybody is at a different starting point, but what have been some of the challenges, and what are some of the obstacles that you've been, or how have you been able to kind of jump over these little hurdles with patients?
Well, and if I would say in general, we're really talking about what I call the stages of change, which is a classic, framework in psychology. Prochaska's trans something model. I can't remember. I'm blocking it. But anyway, and it starts out with pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, and then action. And really that's a great framework for understanding kind of how our brains work. And, we all kind of have a different reality. We, not to get political, we just went through this huge election, and I swear we're all Americans. We all live in the United States when it comes to voting for the president, but boy, we heard some very different realities, didn't we? And we're just not, as a country, unfortunately, all on the same page right now. And I sure hope that changes in some way, that we can find common ground. But that just, points these very, very different perspectives on how people see the world. And so I will tell you that, for example, it's not uncommon for me to be contacted by a adult parent of an adult child, meaning they're over 18, and saying, my kid suffers from X, and I personally have been to a functional medicine doctor, and I know this approach works, and I want to see my kid get better because I just, I love them. And we're like, that's really nice, but what does your adult child want to do? Because you can't force this approach on someone. They really have to be ready for it. Now, everybody's in a different place, and I get folks coming to see me, and they're like, oh, I've done this diet and that diet and that diet, and I'm a keto, whatever, blah, blah, blah. And like, for a moment, you're thinking, how am I supposed to help this person, right?
Yeah.
But you do, because really, ultimately, it's about having someone beside yourself kind of be able to objectively sit down with you in a very compassionate, empathic way, understand where you're coming from, kind of take a look at things and make really incremental changes. It's not, and I love Dr. Walls, don't get me wrong, but it's not like I want to do the Walls protocol, because that's like I want to make a chocolate cake, right? It's about, a cup of this and a half a cup of that, a dash of this and a dash. No, it's, and Dr. Walls would say this as well. It's about embracing the concepts, what she is saying, but ultimately, taking them to the level of the individual, where you have to know where they are, where they're going, what changes they're capable of making. Use these SMART goals. That's where the health coach may come in and help you incrementally. And it's really about the journey, right?
Yeah.
It's not about, we're going to fix this, really. It's about walking hand in hand or shoulder to shoulder with you on this journey. Think of the Star Wars journey of Luke Skywalker, right? That's a classic hero's journey. And it's about all the things that happen. It's about what you put in your backpack when you get started on your journey. It's about the challenges, when it rains on your fire and you have no more matches. How are you going to start the fire? All of the things along the way that challenge you. And what we try to do in the Brain Tune-Up program is create this really solid foundation over about 6 to 12 months, but that doesn't mean it's all done. We're all done. It just means we've created the foundation together, and then I maybe only need to touch base with you every 3 to 6 months. And sometimes that touching base is like, hey, Ryan, how's it going, right? And you're like, oh, yeah, man, da-da-da-da-da. And you might say, well, how's that medicine? Well, it is and it isn't. It's about the human connection. It's about touching base with your mentors, your coach, your guide, your whoever your Obi-Wan Kenobi, and then keeping your mind focused on things so that you continue to move forward on your journey and you don't get sidetracked. Because going back to that Prochaska's 5 stages of change, just because you've taken that action step, after a while, it's easy to fall off the wagon. And it happens all the time. Believe me, it happens every year between Thanksgiving and Christmas for a lot of folks, right?
Yeah.
So, it's like, okay, this isn't the end of the world. It's not ideal. We're going to get back on the wagon. How are we going to do that? Right. And working together. So it's a lifelong process.
Yeah. I mean, I really like how you put that. I think one of the probably most profound things you've ever told me in the past was that functional medicine isn't about the treatment. It's not about the A to B kind of thing. It's about doing all of these things, because it's really functional medicine's taking a look at your whole life. It's not, it's about each facet. It's not about, I think so many people, and I've fallen into this trap too, when you become chronically sick, you focus so hard on it because you've gone to all the doctors, you've seen kind of what the medical system is like for you when you have a problem that isn't just take an antibiotic and it's gone, or something like that, like having a flu or a fever. And when you get sick for a long time, you just, in a sense, you become your own health expert, which can be powerful, but it can also be a detriment because you become this myopically focused machine, and sometimes on the wrong things. And you're not taking into account, I call this like I don't have a word for it, but it's like an identification syndrome, where you identify yourself only as the illness you have. And this is something that, for instance, health coaching is great for, is helping that patient recognize that they are not their illness. It is something that they have, but it isn't who they are or their being. And I think there's a level of separation that everybody needs, from whether it's like their work or their whatever, their illness, to actually start healing. Like you need to allow your brain to have a break from all that stuff. So as we kind of go out in this podcast, I want to kind of ask you one last question: is what do you want to help your patients realize about their control over their health? Like, what do you want them to realize about their health that maybe a conventional doctor just wouldn't tell you? Because a lot of times you'll go to one, or I've been to one, and they just kind of throw their hands up in the air, and we're just like, I'm sorry, but we just don't know, because they haven't had that part of training to think about.
Well, we do have choices, and we make choices every single day, and we're not perfect, and we sometimes make choices that may seem like the right thing at the moment, but ultimately don't turn out to be that good for us, or that they turn out to have an impact. However, on the flip side of things, if you do happen to get sick, just don't fall prey to being the victim. And I think you said it extremely well a moment ago when you're talking about the name. I just need the name, and then I become the person with Lyme disease or the person with mold, because as soon as you start identifying with that illness, like, no, I'm still Ken Sharlin. I happen to have this, but I'm still me. And I still have all the things that I love in life. It's easy to forget about all those good things when you're sick. The cup becomes half empty very quickly. So, understand that true healthcare should be about empowerment. True healthcare should be about partnership. True healthcare should be about inspiration and hope. And that, unfortunately, not enough doctors, although more and more, are learning how to work with their patients in this way. And I personally believe, I was reading an article today. It was an interview between a guy named Isaacson, who's done some very good work exploring Alzheimer's prevention, Richard Isaacson, and Sanjay Gupta, the CNN correspondent. He's an Emory neurosurgeon, I think. And Gupta just wrote a book about brain health. And it was kind of going along. And then they start taking this subtle jab. I think it really, if you knew what you're reading, you'd realize you're sort of taking a jab at Dale Bredesen, because they were talking about how they just really despise practitioners who use the word reversal. And I think if someone is coming around and saying, we're just going to totally cure you of your MS, we're going to totally cure you of your Parkinson's, we're going to totally cure you of your Alzheimer's, completely reverse this disease, I think they are pulling your leg, and you need to be very skeptical, because these diseases really do exist. They really are hardships, and people struggle with them. But on the other hand, when we start to use that word reversal, it gets someone's attention. It says, wait a minute now. What are you actually saying? And explain, right? Like what we're doing here. And when you realize that when we start to engage in that conversation, it becomes about empowerment. It becomes about flattening the curve, to borrow from COVID-19. It becomes this whole discussion about neuroplasticity and resilience and the incredible capacity of the human body that it has to heal itself, to improve, to change that trajectory. And if you can work with someone, you can do it, some of this yourself, don't get me wrong. And we do these podcasts because we want to inspire people to make changes. I wrote my book for that reason. Dr. Walls wrote her book for that reason, but at the same time, it can be challenging. And so know that there are practitioners out there who can take you to another level with all of this, really personalize it and work with you, like me, but there are others. Then magic really does start to happen, and the word reversal is a perfectly reasonable word to use.
I think that's beautifully put, and I really hope people kind of look into your book and even your practice after this episode, because I think there's a little bit of knowledge, or a lot of knowledge really, that anyone can take away. And we've really only kind of just scratched the surface of how far you can go on this journey, because like you mentioned, it's not something that you go on for a day or a walk, or a day or a week or a month. It's really a lifelong system. One thing that I think a lot of people maybe don't realize when they hear of Dr. Wall's story, from going from a wheelchair to riding a bike 18 miles, standing and walking, coming from a reclined wheelchairs, they don't hear all of the continual work she has to do to maintain and keep improving. It's not like she just, like you said, went in, did all this stuff, and then boom, she's fixed. Now she can eat birthday cake all the time and do all this other stuff. You have to stick to.
She has MS.
She has MS. She doesn't, like you said, reversal. I totally believe that is what she went through, is a reversal of symptoms and disease process, but it's still there. It's lingering. If something goes off course, it'll come back. And it's just not, I think a lot of people, that's where they get hung up, is they need to realize that when they're going into the process, that you're beginning a new lifestyle. This is a new phase, new chapter of your life. So Dr. Sharlin, where can people find you, reach out to you, all this good stuff? And then I'll put all of those things in the description when this goes up.
Well, we are on all the major social media platforms. I'm Ken Sharlin, MD, on Facebook, Sharlin Health and Neurology. We also have our Sharlin Health Neurofitness, and our new regeneration center, Sharlin Health Regeneration. So a lot of Facebook presence, Instagram, Twitter, and all that stuff. But I do have a website, and that's functionalmedicine.doctor. So it's not .com, but it's .doctor. And on there, if you just kind of explore around, you can see an opportunity on one of the landing pages to register for a free consultation. We'd be glad to chat with you, hear about what your needs are, how we can help, make sure it's a good fit. So definitely check that out. If all else fails, give us a call. And it's just 417-485-4330.
Awesome. I appreciate you being here. Hopefully we can have you again, because like I said, we only scratched the surface. There's a lot to dig into.